Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. I'm uh I am just so glad you are joining us today because we're embarking on a massive, really profound deep dive into a text that forces us to look at the invisible architecture surrounding every single aspect of our lives.
Yeah, it really does.
We're looking at Naomi Klein's On Fire, The Case for a Green New Deal. But before we go any further, I want to set some ground rules for you and for us. We are not doing a standard book review today. We aren't going to sit here and give a chapter by chapter summary, and we won't be constantly saying, the author says this or the book says that.
Right, because that's not the goal here.
Exactly. Instead, we are using this text as an entry point for a systems level institutional analysis. We're going to map out the hidden machinery that actually drives the way our global society functions.
Which is quite a mission. So, our mission for this deep dive is to deconstruct an extractive political economy that is entirely built around fossil fuel dependence. We are going to examine how this system is designed from the ground up, the deeply embedded incentives that keep it running at full speed, and its inevitable, predictable structural outcomes.
And we really have to look at those outcomes.
We do. We'll look at why it persists despite the existential risks it creates, and how it interlocks with much larger, older global systems. By the time we're finished, you're going to have a comprehensive framework for understanding how seemingly isolated, random global crises are actually deeply connected symptoms of the exact same underlying engine.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the catalyst for this entire analysis starts with a global phenomenon that you have likely seen on your own local news, or maybe even in your own neighborhood. I'm talking about the youth climate strikes.
Yeah, those were incredible.
We are talking about massive, completely unprecedented walkouts. In mid-March 2019, hundreds of thousands of students simply walked out of their classrooms. They didn't ask for permission. There were, 100,000 bodies in the streets of Milan?
Yeah, 100,000 in Milan and 150,000 in Montreal.
It's staggering, and the signs they carried were so striking. The text describes this one young girl who painted a lush, beautiful ecosystem with delicate bumblebees and jungle animals, but right in the center of the poster was an hourglass rapidly running out of sand, noting that 45% of insects have already been lost to climate change.
And what is absolutely vital to understand about these young people is that for them, climate disruption is not some abstract future threat to be debated in a committee room. It's a lived reality right now.
Right, it's not a thought experiment.
No, not at all. They aren't just learning about this in their science textbooks. They are living the physical consequences. When students marched outside the legislature in Cape Town, South Africa, they were doing so just a year after their city of 4 million people nearly hit day zero.
Oh man, day zero. Remind us what day zero actually meant for the people living there.
Well, day zero was the day the municipal water taps were projected to run completely dry.
Just dry, nothing coming out.
Nothing. Imagine living in a major modern metropolis, and the government is telling you that by next month, nothing will come out of your faucet. You will have to go to a military-guarded checkpoint to get a daily ration of water just to survive. That was a reality those students were marching in.
It's terrifying. And it's true across the globe. You look at Vanuatu, where students are protesting while literally watching the sea level swallow their coastlines. The physical map of their country is changing while they are in high school.
Yeah, the geography is literally shifting beneath their feet.
Or in New York City, where teenagers marching on Trump Tower hold vivid, traumatic memories of Superstorm Sandy flooding their childhood homes, wiping out their neighborhoods, leaving them in the dark for weeks. You have kids in San Francisco sharing stories of living with chronic asthma that was dramatically worsened when wildfire smoke completely choked the Bay Area, turning the sky this apocalyptic orange. For this generation, the crisis isn't a theoretical political debate you have at a dinner party. It's the smoke in their lungs and the water in their living rooms.
Which brings us to the first major structural layer we need to analyze to understand why this is happening. We need to look at the system's design. When we talk about the fossil economy, we usually think of it as just a series of energy choices, right?
Yeah, I think that's the default view.
We think, okay, we chose coal and oil to power our homes and cars, and now we need to choose solar and wind. But the institutional analysis argues that fossil fuel dependence is actually a deeply entrenched governance model. It is a foundational pattern that dictates how our entire society is organized.
Wait, a governance model? Break that down for me. Because when I think of governance, I think of Congress or a city council or a mayor. How is fossil fuel a governance model?
It's a governance model because it dictates the boundaries of how we live, work, and interact long before a politician ever signs a bill. It relies on physical infrastructures, massive global supply chains, and local zoning laws that effectively lock our entire civilization into a high-emissions autopilot.
Ah, I see. So when a city builds a sprawling suburb that legally requires every
Precisely. You're operating within a system designed to mandate the consumption of fossil fuels just to participate in basic society. And at the very heart of this design is a grow-or-die mandate. This is a crucial economic concept for you to grasp. Under our current economic model, extractive companies cannot simply maintain their current levels of production, pay their workers, and be considered successful.
They have to keep expanding.
Always. That is not how their value is calculated. Their financial valuations of the global stock market are heavily based on what is called carbon in reserve.
Carbon in reserve. Okay, so we are talking about the oil and gas that is still buried underground.
Yes, these are massive deposits of coal, oil, and gas that fossil fuel companies have mapped, discovered, and purchased the legal rights to develop decades down the road. The stock market looks at a company like Exxon or Chevron and says, we aren't just valuing you based on what you are selling today. We're valuing you based on the millions of barrels of oil you own the rights to extract in the year 2040 or 2050.
So it's basically like a bank evaluating your net worth based on an inheritance you are guaranteed to receive in 20 years. They are counting that future extraction as current wealth.
That is a perfect analogy. The company's stock price, the executives' bonuses, the institutional investments, they're all tied to the ironclad promise that this carbon will eventually be pulled out of the earth and burned. If these companies were to suddenly agree to leave that carbon in the ground to stabilize the global climate, which is what scientists say is absolutely necessary, their financial valuations would collapse overnight. They would instantly lose billions, if not trillions, in on-paper value. Therefore, their institutional survival strictly requires endless growth and endless extraction. It's baked into the math of their existence.
Which brings up a fascinating, almost psychological question. How did we get here? How did we design a system that demands endless extraction on a planet that we all know is finite? I mean, the math simply doesn't work. To understand that, we have to look at the foundational legitimacy story of this system, which is the myth of endlessness. This is the deeply ingrained cultural idea that nature is somehow completely limitless. It's the belief that we will always be able to find more of whatever we need, and that the earth can absorb infinite punishment without consequence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this myth of endlessness is inextricably tied to the history of colonial expansion. When you look at the historical timeline, you see that European powers began hitting hard ecological limits at home centuries ago. They had depleted their great forests for shipbuilding and fuel. They had hunted local game to near extinction. Their soils were becoming exhausted.
They were running out of resources.
Right. But when they hit those limits, they didn't fundamentally change their economic model to become sustainable. Instead, they looked outward. They crossed the oceans and treated the New World, places they quite literally named New France, New England, New Amsterdam, as a spare continent to use for parts.
A spare continent to use for parts. That phrase really hits hard. It perfectly captures how extraction was framed not as a destructive force, but as the ultimate sign of human progress. Ecological limits were completely externalized. You didn't have to worry about running out timber or destroying your soil nutrients because the frontier could always just be pushed further out.
Exactly. And to justify treating an entire continent as a warehouse of spare parts, you have to create intellectual and legal frameworks that make it morally acceptable. This is where concepts like terra nullius come into play. Terra nullius is a Latin term meaning nobody's land. It was a legal concept used by European powers to claim sovereignty over territories that were actually inhabited by indigenous peoples.
By just ignoring that they were already there.
Yes, simply by declaring that because the indigenous people didn't have European-style fences, farms, and property deeds, the land was technically empty and free for the taking.
And it wasn't just a secular legal theory, right? We also have the doctrine of Christian discovery.
Yes, the Doctrine of Discovery was a series of papal bulls decrees from the Pope dating back to the 1400s. These decrees essentially stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers. It provided the ultimate moral and religious cover for extraction and conquest. Along with manifest destiny, the 19th century American belief that expansion across the continent was both justified and inevitable, these frameworks built the psychological foundation for the modern economy.
It is truly mind-bending to realize that 15th century decrees and 19th century expansionist slogans are essentially the structural DNA of our modern resource extraction. And in the process of applying those frameworks, millennia of accumulated indigenous wisdom regarding how to safeguard and regenerate the land were violently swept away. Systems that demanded human beings think 7 generations into the future before making an environmental decision were completely replaced by a system that simply declared the Earth to be boundlessly exhaustible.
This profound transition from indigenous stewardship to limitless colonial extraction fundamentally altered the global incentive structures. And that brings us to the next critical layer of our deep dive, which is the incentive architecture of the modern system. When you look at the world today, a very natural question arises. Why do the institutions governing us continually delay action, even when the scientific community is screaming that the house is on fire? The analysis shows that the answer is that the system structurally rewards delay and incrementalism.
Okay, I understand the financial incentives for the fossil fuel companies. They have to protect their carbon and reserve. But what about the politicians? Surely, when a catastrophic hurricane hits a major city or half a state catches on fire, that has to be a wake-up call that forces the political system to change.
You would think so, but the political incentives are entirely misaligned with the reality of the crisis. Let's look at how political targets have been set over the last few decades. Up until very recently, you would constantly hear politicians proudly announce targets like, "We are committing to an 80% reduction in emissions by the year 2050.
Right, which sounds incredibly ambitious and responsible on a press release.
It sounds great on paper, but look at the cynical genius of that timeline. By setting the target decades into the future, the politicians currently holding office completely offload the difficult, politically dangerous task of confronting the fossil fuel business model onto their successors. They get the good PR, the applause, and the environmental endorsements today. But someone else, someone who isn't even in office yet, has to deal with the massive economic friction of actually shutting down a coal plant or transition a power grid tomorrow.
It's the ultimate way to pass the buck. Short election cycles of 2 to 4 years mean that a politician is only incentivized to care about what happens before the next midterm. Taking aggressive climate action requires spending political capital now for a benefit that won't be realized until long after they have retired.
And even when well-meaning policies attempt to address the issue within our current growth-dependent framework, they almost always fall victim to structural traps. A perfect example of this is the Jevons paradox. This is an incredibly important economic concept for understanding why we haven't solved this yet.
Let's translate this one because it's a bit of an academic term. What exactly is the Jevons paradox?
So, William Stanley Jevons was a 19th century English economist. He observed something fascinating about coal usage. When the steam engine was improved to use coal much more efficiently, people assumed total coal consumption would drop. But Jevons noticed the exact opposite happened. Because the engines were more efficient, it became cheaper and more profitable to use them. So industries built way more steam engines, and total coal consumption skyrocketed.
Oh, I see. It's kind of like ordering a diet soda so you feel justified eating 2 bacon cheeseburgers. You invent a more efficient engine, pat yourself on the back for saving fuel, and then immediately use that efficiency to build a massive, heavier SUV and drive it twice as far.
Exactly. The Jevons paradox observes that relying purely on technological efficiency fails to reduce overall consumption in a growth-based economy. For example, if we make aircraft engines 20% more fuel efficient, the cost of flying goes down. Consequently, airlines offer cheaper tickets, more people fly, and airlines expand their fleets. The efficiency simply fuels the GDP growth imperative, while total global emissions continue to rise, completely thwarting the intended environmental progress. We cannot innovate our way out of the problem if the system just absorbs that innovation to grow the overall extractive footprint.
It's the ultimate trap. And there's a much darker side to this incentive architecture, specifically regarding how the system deals with the damage it causes. Because dirty energy requires sacrifice, it requires sacrificial people, and it requires sacrificial places.
This introduces the concept of sacrifice zones. It sounds like a dystopian term from a sci-fi novel, but it's actually a phrase that scientists and bureaucrats advising the U.S. government openly used back in the 1970s. The analysis here heavily emphasizes that you absolutely cannot have a fossil fuel-powered economy without designating certain geographies and populations as expendable. The costs and risks of extraction are almost always displaced downward onto those who have the least political and economic power to resist.
Wait, so the system actually bakes in the idea that certain places just have to be completely destroyed for the engine to keep running. What does that actually look like in practice?
It looks like mountaintop removal in Appalachia. In order to get to the coal seams, coal companies realized it was cheaper to use explosives to literally blast the tops off ancient mountains, rather than paying miners to dig tunnels. Millions of tons of rock and debris are then pushed into the surrounding valleys, burying streams and destroying local watersheds. The heavy metals leach into the drinking water, causing severe health crises for the local communities. But because it saves on labor costs, the system deems that mountain and the people living below it as a necessary sacrifice.
And it's not just coal. You look at the Niger Delta, where multinational oil companies have operated for decades. The region has experienced thousands of oil spills that have utterly devastated the mangrove forests, poisoned the fish, and destroyed the local livelihoods of communities that rely on that ecosystem. Or you look at the toxic tailing ponds in the Alberta tar sands in Canada. These are
The human toll of maintaining these sacrifice zones is profound, and it is entirely predictable. There is a deeply tragic irony highlighted in the analysis regarding the community of Attawapiskat in northern Canada. A massive De Beers diamond mine operates right on the community's traditional territory, pulling immense wealth out of the earth. But the local indigenous population living right next door suffers from profound trauma, neglect, and a lack of basic infrastructure. On a single Saturday night in 2016, 11 people in a community of just 2,000 attempted to take their own lives.
That is just heartbreaking.
It really is. This epidemic of despair is directly linked to the systemic trauma of forced separation from land, culture, and power. The very separation is required to maintain these sacrifice zones for the benefit of distant financial centers.
It's incredibly heavy to process. And when you look at how the system protects these sacrifice zones and how it protects its own growth mandate, you have to look at the role of denial. Now, here's where we need to look really closely at the institutional strategy. When we see climate denial, when we hear politicians or pundits claiming the science is a hoax, it's very easy to just assume they're scientifically illiterate or that they just don't understand the data. But Klein's systems analysis argues something completely different. It argues that denial is actually a highly rational, incentive-compatible strategy.
What's fascinating here is how we can analyze organizations like the Heartland Institute, a prominent conservative think tank that has spent years casting doubt on climate science. If you look at their strategy not as a failure of education, but as an ideological defense mechanism, it makes perfect sense. They aren't denying the science because they're stupid. They're doing it because it protects their worldview and their wallets.
Okay, break that down for me. How does denying science protect their worldview?
Think about what it would actually mean to accept the reality of climate breakdown. If you accept that fossil fuels are destroying the habitability of the planet, then you must logically accept the need to heavily regulate corporations, dramatically shift wealth away from polluters, and fundamentally rebuild the public sphere to manage a massive global transition. For someone whose entire ideology, identity, and financial portfolio is built on the core tenets of free market, unregulated capitalism, those actions are deeply existentially threatening. Therefore, funding disinformation and denying the science is a perfectly rational, incentive-compatible strategy to protect massive asset values, avoid historical liability for the damage caused, and preserve institutional stability.
So, if the system is designed for endless growth, and it is structurally incentivized to delay action, displace risk onto vulnerable communities, and fund denial to protect itself, what actually happens when the literal storms arrive? This moves us into tracing the predictable structural outcomes of this system. Because when disasters strike, they do not hit a level playing field. Climate events act as massive threat multipliers that amplify pre-existing inequalities.
The quintessential example of this in the text is Hurricane Maria's impact on Puerto Rico. When a Category 4 hurricane hits an island, it is obviously going to cause damage. But when Maria hit Puerto Rico, it didn't just blow down sturdy, well-maintained, resilient infrastructure. The analysis shows that Puerto Rico's infrastructure, its power grid, its hospitals, its roads, was already starved, neglected, and heavily dysfunctional due to a long history of colonial economics, unpayable debt, and imposed austerity measures from the mainland.
So the storm was the catalyst, but the pre-existing economic vulnerability was the true disaster.
Exactly. The result wasn't just wind damage, it was a total systemic infrastructure breakdown. Millions of American citizens were left for months without power, without clean drinking water, and without functioning medical equipment. That structural failure is what led to roughly 3,000 deaths. The storm exposed the fact that the system had already deemed the island's infrastructure as a low priority, essentially, another form of a sacrifice zone.
It's a stark demonstration of how the system treats certain populations. The analysis links this directly to what is called the gig and dig economy. Let's think about the gig economy for a second. If you are an Uber driver or a freelance delivery worker, you are treated as a highly precarious resource. You are used up for your labor, and you can be deactivated or discarded at a moment's notice without any benefits, healthcare, or security. The dig economy treats the Earth itself in the exact same way. Both human life and the natural world are reduced to disposable lines on a spreadsheet, to be exhausted and eventually abandoned when they are no longer profitable.
And yet, despite these glaring, fatal systemic failures, you have to ask why there isn't a constant mass uprising against these structures. The reason is that the system has a very powerful built-in stabilizer. It is designed to absorb systemic critiques by shifting the burden of the crisis entirely onto you, the individual. This is the narrative of individual responsibility. Whenever public awareness of the climate crisis grows, the dominant culture swiftly pivots to tell you that solving it is your personal consumer duty.
Oh, this is the recycling bin anxiety. You've heard it a million times and you've probably felt it. To save the planet, you personally need to buy a hybrid car. You need to sort your plastics perfectly. You need to make sure you bring your Candace tote bag to the grocery store. You need to change all your light bulbs to LEDs. And if the ice caps are melting, well, it's because you took too long of a shower.
Precisely. And the systems-level analysis here is brilliant. It explains how this narrative acts as a massive cultural stabilizer. It takes our collective, very justified, deep-seated anxiety about the survival of our planet and channels it into endless lifestyle optimization. We are encouraged to form a green identity through shopping, but this is a deliberate structural illusion.
It's a total distraction. By keeping you hyper-focused on your own relatively microscopic carbon footprint, the system actively discourages you from looking up and confronting the massive structural drivers of the crisis. There is data showing that just 100 corporate and state fossil fuel giants, often called the carbon majors, are responsible for a staggering 71% of all global greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. As long as you are agonizing in the grocery aisle over which type of ethically sourced reusable bag to buy, you are not organizing your community to demand the heavy regulation, taxation, or dismantling of those top 100 polluters. The individual responsibility narrative functions perfectly to protect the status quo from structural confrontation.
And to understand how this status quo became so deeply entrenched, we need to look at a series of historical feedback loops. This is one of the most compelling and frankly heartbreaking parts of the institutional analysis. There is a tragic timing mismatch that has profoundly hobbled humanity's ability to respond to climate change over the last few decades.
Let's go back to the late 1980s. This is a critical juncture. In 1988, scientists, most notably Dr. James Hansen, testified before the U.S. Congress. He presented definitive, undeniable proof to global governments that human-caused climate change was real, it was happening now, and that avoiding absolute catastrophe would require massive collective public action and stringent global corporate regulation to curb emissions.
So we had the scientific mandate. A planetary emergency was officially on the table, and the cure required a strong, well-funded public sphere to coordinate a massive global transition. But look at what was happening in global politics at that exact same historical moment. Just as the scientific consensus demanded robust public action, the dominant political ideology of the Western world shifted aggressively toward neoliberalism. This was the era of Ronald Reagan in the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher in the U.K.
And the prevailing political trend of neoliberalism was the exact opposite of what the climate crisis required. For the next 30 years, the global political focus became an obsession with privatization, deregulation, slashing corporate taxes, dismantling public services, and drastically weakening organized labor.
It is a devastating historical clash. Think about the tragedy of that timing. A global crisis that fundamentally required cooperative public sector planning collided head-on with an ideological crusade explicitly designed to destroy the very concept of collective public sector planning. We needed to exert unprecedented controls over corporate behavior precisely when corporate power was becoming entirely unconstrained. We needed strong, resilient public institutions precisely when politicians were actively starving and unmaking those very institutions.
And this massive deregulation paved the way for another vicious feedback loop, which is disaster capitalism. When these climate-fueled disasters strike like a hurricane or a massive wildfire, they produce a sudden need for emergency spending and rebuilding. But because the public sphere has been intentionally hollowed out over the last 30 years, the government often lacks the capacity to respond. So the recovery is almost entirely privatized. The massive government contracts go to large private corporations, which often use the crisis to push through further privatization of schools or power grids, ultimately deadening the inequality in the affected regions.
And there is a deeply concerning political consequence to this cycle. As you, the listener, watch your community suffer from climate impacts, and you watch your institutions utterly fail to protect you while private contractors make millions, your trust in those institutions completely collapses. You feel abandoned.
And that collapse of trust creates a dangerous vacuum. The analysis maps out how, when populations feel deeply economically insecure and abandoned by traditional democratic institutions, it opens the door for extreme political movements. Violent, hard-right factions rise to power not by solving the climate crisis, but by stoking xenophobia and scapegoating migrants, ethnic minorities, and marginalized groups for the economic pain people are feeling. The ecological crisis and the crisis of rising authoritarianism are in a lethal, reinforcing dialogue with one another.
But it is crucial to note that the analysis doesn't just diagnose the disease. It also evaluates a proposed countersystem designed to break these exact feedback loops. This is where the concept of the Green New Deal comes into play in the text. It is framed not just as a standard environmental policy, not just a carbon tax or a subsidy for solar panels, but as a systemic alternative designed to act as a backlash buster.
A backlash buster. Let's explain why that is necessary. Why do slandered climate policies often fail? Let's look at Emmanuel Macron's fuel tax in France as a perfect example of this. A few years ago, the French government tried to address emissions by simply raising the cost of fossil fuels. It makes sense on a spreadsheet. If gas costs more, people will drive less. But in reality, it placed an unbearable immediate economic burden on working-class people who live outside the city centers and absolutely rely on their cars to get to work and survive.
The predictable result of placing the financial burden of the climate transition squarely on the shoulders of the working class was the massive, furious Yellow Vest rebellion. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, paralyzing the country. The lesson is clear. If climate policies only increase the cost of living for everyday people without providing alternatives, the political backlash will utterly destroy the policy. You cannot separate the transition off fossil fuels from the demand for economic justice.
So the Green New Deal proposes a completely different loop. It argues that the only way to build enough popular working-class support to actually take on the entrenched power of the fossil fuel giants is to combine emissions reductions with tangible, immediate benefits for the public. This means tying the push for decarbonization directly to job guarantees, universal health care, affordable housing, and repairing decaying infrastructure. It's about building empathy and economic resilience at the exact same time you are building wind turbines and solar grids.
It creates a positive, reinforcing feedback loop. By making people's daily lives more secure, by ensuring they won't go bankrupt from medical bills or lose their livelihood during the transition away from a coal economy, you drastically lower their vulnerability to the political demagogues who prey on economic fear. You build the social cohesion and the trust that are absolutely necessary to weather the immense societal changes required to stabilize the global climate.
So if the alternatives like a Green New Deal are clear and the science is undeniable and the house is literally on fire, wait, I shouldn't say literally, but you know what I mean. The house is on fire. We have to ask the biggest question of all. Why does the system persist? Why is it so incredibly hard to just change course and stop driving off the cliff?
The lock-in is profound, and it exists on multiple overlapping levels. First, there's the sheer staggering financial entanglement. Globally, governments subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of hundreds of billions, if not trillions, of dollars annually. And let's be clear about what a subsidy is in this context. It's not just a government writing a check. It's tax breaks for deep water exploration. It's public land leased for pennies on the dollar. It's state-funded military protection to secure global shipping routes for oil tankers.
There is also massive infrastructure inertia. Entire modern cities, national power grids, and intricate global supply chains have been built over a century around the fundamental assumption of cheap combustible carbon. The institutional risk aversion to dismantling a multi-trillion-dollar industry makes the current order feel totally inevitable to the people in power. It feels easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of fossil fuels.
There is a really fascinating moment in the analysis that captures this perfectly. It references a presentation by a complex systems researcher named Brad Werner at a major scientific conference. Werner is an expert in advanced computer models of Earth-human systems. He titled his presentation provocatively, "Is Earth Fructed?" Quite the title for a serious scientific conference. Indeed. And his conclusion based on running these complex models, was essentially that the friction-free, barrier-free, rapid depletion of resources facilitated by global free market capitalism has made the planet's systems dangerously unstable. The system is structurally accelerating toward its own destruction, yet the economic and political inertia makes it incredibly difficult to apply the brakes. The models literally show that resistance to the system, activism, regulation, friction, is the only dynamic that can prevent total collapse.
And that inertia isn't just physical infrastructure or financial portfolios, it is deeply ideological. This brings us right back to the colonial inheritance we discussed earlier. The system persists because the underlying templates of governance, the deeply rooted intellectual theories required to justify unequal harm, are still highly active today. Those concepts of terra nullius and manifest destiny aren't just historical footnotes in a textbook. They are the active narratives required right now to justify why it is acceptable to turn the Niger Delta, or the Navajo Nation, or the coast of Louisiana into toxic sacrifice zones, just so that the global north can maintain its illusion of endless consumption.
The historical continuity is staggering, and this is where we need to connect the persistence of this system to the nested systems of history.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text makes a historical connection that absolutely blew my mind, tying all of these massive nested global systems together in one specific decade. The author describes floating in the waters off the coast of Australia, looking down at the dying, bleached coral of the Great Barrier Reef, a direct casualty of warming oceans. And as she is floating there, she realizes that she is in the exact same waters navigated by the British explorer Captain James Cook in the year 1770.
Yes, the 1770s convergence. It is a stunning, paradigm-shifting historical framing. Let's trace the timeline. Captain Cook maps the coast of Australia in 1770, claiming it for the British Crown under the doctrine of terra nullius, paving the way for brutal colonial expansion and the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Just 6 years later, in 1776, James Watt's commercial steam engine is introduced to the market. This invention massively accelerates the Industrial Revolution by allowing humanity to harness the immense power of burning coal, fundamentally changing labor and production.
But wait, there is more in 1776. In that exact same year, the Scottish economist Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. This book lays the intellectual and moral foundation for modern free market capitalism, providing the theory that unregulated self-interest leads to the greatest good. And of course, 1776 is the exact year the United States formally declares its independence, accelerating the massive, violent colonial expansion across the North American continent.
It all happens in the exact same historical breath. Think about the gravity of that convergence, the origins of global colonial land grabs, the intellectual birth of unchecked racial capitalism, and the mass industrialization powered by fossil fuels. They are entirely interwoven. They were born together, they matured together, and they reinforce each other. And as the analysis points out, we are currently living in Captain Cook's climate. We are breathing the atmosphere created by the direct convergence of those specific historical forces.
Which means we can't solve the carbon problem without addressing the historical and economic systems that created the carbon problem. They are the same thing.
Exactly. This raises an incredibly important analytical point, and it is where we must explicitly apply the concept of a crisis in perception. When we treat climate change simply as a standalone technical environmental issue, when we view it as just a math problem of too many carbon molecules in the atmosphere, completely detached from the histories of colonial power, precarious labor, housing inequality, and civil rights, we are suffering from a fundamental crisis in perception. It is a profound failure to see that the climate crisis is merely a symptom. The underlying disease is a massive, nested crisis of extractive dominance.
So what is the crisis in perception here?
If we synthesize this analytically, there are 4 key components to the crisis in perception we face. First, we must clarify what is being misperceived. We consistently misperceive climate breakdown as a distant, isolated ecological problem. We misperceive it as an issue that can somehow be solved by individual virtue, like carrying a reusable water bottle, making better consumer choices, and waiting for minor technological tweaks to our engines. Second, what structural layer is obscured by that view? This surface-level interpretation obscures a massive, underlying extractive economy and governance model. It hides a system that intentionally distributes harm and risk based on political power, treating both vulnerable human beings and the planet itself as utterly disposable commodities. Third, why does this surface interpretation fail? It fails because it attempts to treat the symptoms, the carbon emissions themselves, without ever confronting the institutional engines, the historical myths of endlessness, and the ironclad profit incentives that absolutely require extraction to survive. You cannot cure a disease by only treating the cough. And finally, how does a systems-level analysis change our visibility? By applying a systems-level analysis, we finally see clearly that climate disruption and social justice are not separate issues to be debated in different political arenas. They are the exact same structural fight. They are a singular battle over who bears the costs of our economy, who gets to define the future, and who gets protected when the literal and metaphorical storms hit.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.